as the war in Russia continues, or in Ukraine against Russia continues to rage on, there has been some movement on the tactical front over the last 12 to 24 hours in that Chasiv Yar city, kind of in the center of the eastern front there, which Russia's been trying to take for quite some time. There's been some significant movement along on that battlefront. It's just been a vicious war. It's kind of small when you look at it on the map, but it has important operational implications, not strategic, but operational along the front lines in there. There are also things going on off the battlefield that have just as much impact, if not more so, about the course of the war. We're going to talk about all of that today with one of our favorite guests, Matt Ho, former State Department, former combat Marine, and a close friend of mine and just a wonderful human being. Matt, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Danny. It's good to be here with you.
Yeah, it's been a while since we've had you on there. A little bit too long. We need to correct that deficiency. We missed your analysis over here. I hope you had a good 4th of July, by the way. That was yesterday. So I know you had some things going on down there in North Carolina.
Right, a lot of heat. It was 100 degrees down here. So I think most of us stayed inside, and I hope you did as well. Hope everyone had a safe 4th of July. I was a combat engineer, so certainly a fan of demolitions, but also know how easily things can go badly with things that go boom. So hope everyone was safe and everyone still has their all 10 fingers and whatnot.
They did, yeah. I had the barbecue grill fired up, so I did all the traditional things. So it was really nice. Thanks for asking. But speaking of things that go boom. We've been having a lot of things on the front lines in Chasiv Yar, and just to kind of to bring people up that may not know, Gary, if you could bring that map up there. Chasiv Yar is a medium-sized town, a total of about 12,000 people, but it's in a kind of an important, operationally important area of the front. And here, just so you can see on this, understand what you're looking at here on this map. Chasiv Yar is kind of a conglomeration of three kind of elements of it that are connected there. The main town is kind of on the left, but there's kind of in the middle of your screen there. You can't really see it that well on this map, but there's a canal, a sort of a river that runs in between those two sections. One on the left that's in the white, and one on the right that's in the covered in the pink. The area in the pink was called the micro district. You may have heard that if you've been watching any of the operational situations on that in that battle. It's been something they've been fighting over for quite a long time. And Russia decided to use what can only be described as just a destruction methodology with their overwhelming advantage in firepower, where they have just decided to, instead of storming the city, trying to go block by block and doing a Stalingrad kind of a deal, they just decided to just destroy the structures. And Gary's going to show you a few of the video here. And one of the things I want to point out right off the bat, as you can see from this, you can literally see the FAB bombs coming in on target. And what you notice, there is no air defense at all. All these bombs come in completely uninhibited. And the Ukrainian troops had been hiding in many of these buildings, especially the high rises. And Russia has just been methodically pummeling them one at a time. I think some of the other video he's going to show in a minute is going to show you what the micro district looks like now. And you can see that the thing has been rubbled so badly that one of the satellite images I saw, it just looks like dust where all the buildings were. And so the Ukraine side has nowhere else to hide. So now that they've moved back to the left, that original map I showed you, back into the main Chasiv Yar area, back onto the left side of this. And now then that's the next setup there where the Russians are now going to start, because they've lost the micro district on the right there. Now then the remainder of the city, about 70% of what's left, is at a much greater risk of falling because Ukraine side just doesn't have the resources to do this. And Matt, as a combat engineer, I wonder if you can, those are the video images I'm talking about there. You see that there's hardly any buildings even left standing from which anybody can hide in. Can you talk to us about the difficulty of defending something like this against that onslaught?
Oh, it's just unimaginable. But my first thoughts, Danny, when watching this, as you said, there's no defense against this. And my immediate thoughts are, why not? Why isn't there a defense against this? Certainly, the Russians have been able to defend against the American version of these bombs, the JDAMs, the GPS guided bombs, through electronic warfare. This is the result of an American military that has failed to understand the reality of modern war. This is the need for electronic warfare is nothing new. This goes back decades. 20 years ago, when we were in Iraq, Danny, we were dealing with this, an American military confronted with the reality of dealing of say just remote controlled roadside bombs. And we in the Marine Corps and the Army did similar, brought in electronic warfare officers. So every infantry battalion had an electronic warfare officer assigned to them, as well as all kinds of new equipment and kit, and as well as tactics and techniques and procedures to deal with this new realm of what was to us new realm of electronic warfare. It wasn't new, but certainly 20 years ago it was much newer than it is now. So there's no excuse for the Ukrainians not to have a defense against these weapons, which are more or less, I know there's differences in how they actually work, but overall, there's not much of a difference between how they operate and how our own JDAMs operate. And the fact that the Russians are able to defend against our JDAMs, they've been doing it for almost 2 years now in Ukraine. And the fact that we have no ability to help the Ukrainians protect themselves. And this goes to the larger tale of this war. This goes to the larger story of the American military. And, one example of why is it that the Americans can't win wars? It's because we can't even produce the equipment. We can't even train the personnel to fight a modern war, because these modern wars go against not just the grain and ideology of the American military, but the grain and ideology and profit of the military-industrial complex. So there's not a lot of money to be made in electronic warfare.
How can it be, Matt, that the United States spends close to $1 trillion a year on its total defense budget when you add everything in together, and which is more than whatever it is, like the next 10 combined people, and that means even some of our friends. Right. A lot more than double what the total of the entire military budget for China and Russia, the two other superpowers, more than double combined. How can we possibly be behind on these kinds of technical issues?
And it's not like we're not a technology oriented nation, right? It's not like we have a dominance in some areas of technology, not in all, but in some areas. And certainly we have been world leaders in aspects of technology. And this threat, the idea that we are going to need to have not just offensive, but defensive electronic warfare capabilities, has something that even as improvised explosive devices, a component of which involved electronic warfare, even if it was just a long-range cordless telephone, which was 20 years ago in Iraq in 2004, north of Baghdad in where I was, and to Crete, and then in throughout the Tigris River Valley and up to Kirkuk. That was the danger. Just these long-range cordless telephones that could initiate an IED from a couple kilometers away. And we were losing guys left and right to those, whether they were being killed or wounded or just their bells rung, losing vehicles. So, and that was 20 years ago. I can't emphasize that enough. And here we are in the largest conventional war that the world has seen in 80 years. A war that the United States Army has been pining for, has been looking forward to. One thing, if you were part of the military throughout the global war on terror, there was this feeling within the services that we got to get out of this and we got to get back to what we do well. We got to get back to where our roots are. We got to get back to what's best for our institutions. Iraq and Afghanistan was not good for any of the services, and all in terms of what type of equipment they procure, in terms of career advancement, in terms of how like their units are constructed and who gets to be in command of what. The need to get back to where the Army is in Europe ready to fight a major tank war again. You could feel it, particularly once, you got into several years of the Iraq and Afghan messes. But I mean, so the idea that they're not prepared for this, it just goes to show on a host of all the levels we've talked about this. Why can't we produce enough 155 rounds, for artillery shells? Why do the drones that we sent over there not work? The drones we sent to Ukraine, specifically the Switchblade drones, which are the ones that were, one of the first wonder weapons. So if you go back 2 years ago, you'll hear about these Switchblade kamikaze drones. They are practically useless. The Ukrainians said, stop sending us these. They don't work. And what the Ukrainians did was they started buying drones from China. So then now
did they not work because they didn't function properly, or because of electronic warfare?
Because of electronic warfare. Yeah, thanks for clarifying that. Because of electronic warfare, and they couldn't be updated, they couldn't be amended, they couldn't be redone to counter the Russian
do that
counters.
On the fly, man.
And so what happens? The Ukrainians start buying Chinese drones, right? So now we have reports that upwards of half of the drones Ukraine is using come from China. And just to put the cherry on the top of all this, Andrew Coburn wrote about this a week or two ago. People have seen probably reports about this large investment in drone warfare that the Americans are going to make, that this is going to be the way that until we build a 400 ship Navy or whatever fever dream they have, in the Pentagon, that until that comes to pass, the way we are going to fight and hold off a Chinese invasion of Taiwan is through drone warfare. And the program is known as the Replicator program. We're going to have just thousands and thousands of these drones, and they're going to swarm and overwhelm the Chinese and so on and so forth. And supposedly, what drone is the mainstay of that program? The Switchblade drone, one that didn't work in Ukraine, right? But it's making.
Well, I doubt that Vladimir Putin gave the secret codes to Xi Jinping yesterday when they were at the SCO. So I'm sure that he doesn't know that.
Well, that's we've asked. There's been a lot of questions about how come the Americans, the West, NATO, Europe, hasn't given their most advanced stuff to Ukraine, right? Their most advanced equipment. Why did it take us 6-7 months to give them basically either newly built Abrams or rebuilt Abrams? I'm never sure what they got, but they got M1A1s. How come we didn't give them M1A2s, the stuff that our guys use? And the assumption is that, well, we don't want that falling into Russian hands. We don't want them to have the ability to look at these vehicles, know exactly how the armor is constructed, learn how to defeat it. We don't want to see them we don't want to see how they operate, right? Them to see is how they operate and everything. There's also a question out there that is, maybe this stuff doesn't work that well, and we don't want to let that cat out of the bag. So maybe it's not just a question of we don't want our enemies to know how our equipment operates. We don't want them to get their hands on our latest technology and then understand it, be able to counter it, reverse engineer it, whatever. But we also maybe don't want not just our enemies, but all those people around the world who buy our weapons to know that our stuff doesn't work that well. I'm not sure how much of there that is, but after seeing how Western equipment, Western munitions have worked in Ukraine, after seeing how the overall American military industrial complex, along with the European minor version of that, mini version of that, has performed these last 2.5 years, over the fact that you get this idea that we can't stop Russian glide bombs, but the Russians can stop our glide bombs. You have to wonder about how fragile are these Western militaries? Just how much of a paper tiger is the American military? How dangerous would an actual real conflict have been?
Matt, that's one of the things I think is one of the least recognized major disasters of this war for us and our misguided strategies, to the extent there are any, and our actions. I'll put it that way. Is that by giving, whether belatedly or early, by giving them all this stuff to use that at least is representative of some of the major components of any war that we would fight, we have just handed a golden opportunity to Russia and ergo to any other of their allies that we may fight at some point in the future. They now know how to defeat our weapons before we even enter the battle on some of the key issues, HIMARS, ATACMS, of course, the Abrams, the Switchblades you mentioned, several other categories of things They know how to defeat our stuff, and we don't know how to counter that stuff because we're not working on the ground with it. Yeah. So in any initial fight somewhere else, we would be at an immediate disadvantage. As in the glide bomb issue on both sides of that count is one of the biggest ones. And I just don't think there's enough recognition of how vulnerable we've made ourselves.
Well, also too, the American mindset for warfare has been it's going to look like the first Iraq War, the Gulf War. It's going to look like Baghdad in 2003. It's going to be quick and lightning and over, shock and awe, like that kind of thing. I mean, so you don't have the expectation that these wars, a war with Russia, a war with China, will go on for longer than a couple of weeks. Our game plan is we're going to overwhelm them and they're going to collapse. There's going to be basically a domino effect because we're going to decapitate their leadership. We're going to destroy their communication. We'll kill off the vital nodes that support and tie together their militaries, and their militaries will collapse because they'll be headless. Essentially, that's what the game plan has been. And then, of course, the idea, though, the thought, though, of what happens if that doesn't work? What happens if you start getting into week 3, week 4 of this war? What happens if essentially what happened in Iraq, if you're there and the Iraqis didn't get the memo that they were supposed to not keep fighting us? I mean, like along the lines, or also too, just go back 2 years, 2.5 years now. The idea, the expectation was that most American military and analysts had this view that the Russians were going to sweep through Ukraine, because they expected the Russian military to perform as we did. They expected the Russian military to just carry out their offensive as we would. They expected it all to go just as it happens in all our war colleges and all our war games and all our white papers, etc. How just A follows B follows C. And of course you hit, this with that missile, which then the domino effect, and that unit out on the ground has no ability to shoot, move, or communicate because you decapitated everything that supports it. What happens if that doesn't work? And, you look at the way the Russians have adapted in this war. And my God, can you imagine, and look at the way we've adapted and how slow we've been and how ham-fisted and how poor we've been at it. Can you imagine if we were into month 6, month 12, month 18 of an actual war with Russia? I know that's a bit preposterous because the assumption is that eventually it would just go nuclear. But say we wave a magic wand,
conventional,
yeah. Say we wave a magic wand, sprinkle some fairy dust, and nukes aren't involved. Could you imagine that? Would you put any money on our leadership to be better at this than the Russian leadership at month 6, at month 12, at month 18? What gives us any idea that the American leadership would be able to be adaptive, would be able to be intuitive, would be able to have the humility to say, this didn't work right, so we're going to do this now? Let alone beggar off, let alone put off or push off the tentacles of the military-industrial complex, right? I mean, right? I mean, when you look at it that way, in terms of people ask about that, this idea of like a Russia-U.S. military confrontation, and how would the M1A2 do against the T90 or whatever, I mean, I don't think that matters at all. It's because the leadership is so poor on our side that we would not be able to think our way through a war and win. That the Russians would be much more adept, much smarter. They've got a lot more experience now than we do, of course. But, I mean, this idea of a confrontation, a conflict, a war with Russia, if it didn't go nuclear, I think it would be a catastrophe for the U.S. and the West, because I just don't think that we have the leadership to win a war.
Well,
let alone the infrastructure set up. And then that's not even taking the fact of who else would join Russia's side. And
and there's so many other things that would go on off that, but the core issue is I think the most important issue. And I have observed myself, but also talked to some people who have some knowledge that Russia had its own problems with a lot of poor leadership at the beginning at nearly every level, operational, strategic, and tactical. But they burned away a lot of those. So they found out what happened. They fired these people. They brought up new people who succeeded. They moved them up as an institution. Now they're finally belatedly, as they have done many times in their military history over centuries, really. Now that they're starting to do what makes sense and what's right. But our side so far, I mean, we don't ever fire anyone for incompetence. I don't know the last time. I literally can't remember any example where someone had failed on the battlefield, failed to do the job, and they were relieved because of it. It's been they did some kind of sexual stuff or whatever, or they had toxic relationships, something like that. They actually have fired a few for that, but not for physical, professional incompetence. So all the people who are at these higher levels right now, and this has been my experience from the whole time I was in, you have to be so political and do whatever the boss wants. And that means don't take risk. Don't be rocking the boat, keep the status quo going. And so all these people have been raised up through that, all the way at the upper echelon. So when they actually get into a situation where they don't get to call the shots, to where they can't just tell people what to do and then everything changes. And I'm going to tell you two quick stories that were experienced this. During my time in active duty, I was in Korea at the time, and there was a simulation exercise that was going on, a combination simulation field training exercise. And the radios, the telephones for the commanding general for the operation went out. And he was just absolutely furious that he lost communication with some of these people. And basically they just kind of reset the deal, and they waited, they paused until they got the lines communication established. Then they continued on with it. And I was thinking, even at that time, can you imagine if this was a real war? What are you going to do, man? The war doesn't stop because your telephone doesn't work. But he just couldn't stand. I mean, he just went crazy for that, and everything stopped. And then they rescheduled it. And of course, we win because it's all scheduled. The second one was even worse in my view, because the situation was going wrong. All the things that they had tried weren't working, so they just reset everything, magic everybody back to where they were, and then continued on. And nobody thinks that, wait, if this was real, you'd be dead. And right. All of your battalions would have been wiped out there. And so that mentality doesn't get in, that we have to figure out what to do when that happens.
Right. I'll give you a Korea War game story as well. I was the engineer for the Marines for a Korean War game back in 2000 or whenever. And, we were advancing, and we didn't get very far, and we had to use our bridging assets because, of course, North Koreans would destroy their bridges as we advanced. And, the assumption being we were advancing, that wasn't even under question, right? So the assumption being that we were advancing. And, very quickly we ran out of bridging equipment. And then it was just, the fairy dust came in, as we used to call it, right? And fairy dust was sprinkled on the war game, and all of a sudden we had unlimited bridging equipment. And so we were able to advance north and do what we needed to do to win the war game. You saw it over and over again. I mean, with personnel, we go back 20 years again to 2004 in Iraq. Look, General George Casey was the commander of U.S. and Allied forces in Iraq. He was the commanding general of MNFI, a multinational force Iraq. When he leaves in 05 or whenever, 06, he gets promoted to chief of staff of the army, even though that war is clearly lost, even though we're clearly losing that war. Lieutenant General Vines, who is the Corps commander, I believe Vines was the Corps commander then, he gets promoted as well. I mean, like, you just saw it over and over again, the most egregious being David Petraeus, who, when I was there, was in charge of the training command, Minsticky, as we call it. I'm not going to try and remember what that acronym was, but that was a training command that was supposed to train the police and military, the Iraqi police and military. I mean, absolute colossal failure under Petraeus, not just in terms of like turning out units that actually could operate and fight on the battlefield, let alone win a counterinsurgency fight and all that stuff. But also too, his command lost hundreds of thousands of rifles and pistols during that time, as well as this is where we saw the death squads take off in 2004 into 2005, that ignite that civil war that we totally caused by our invasion and occupation. But what happens to Petraeus, even after that just complete disaster, even after everyone knew he lied and cooked the books to say that Mosul was in better shape than it actually was. Petraeus leaves as the commanding general up in Mosul. He says that things are going well here. It's going so well, you don't need a full division to replace me. This is in the fall of 2004 or so, I guess. And what did they replace him with? They replaced him in Mosul with an armored cavalry regiment. Just simply not nearly enough guys. and the whole thing blows up, as we all know.
Yeah, and that's where basically ISIS in Iraq.
Yeah, you know, I mean, like, but Petraeus goes from that where he lies, and this colossal operational failure occurs. You know, in terms of control of Mosul, he goes to the training command, complete disaster, complete catastrophe. Not just operational failures, but strategic failures. Now you have the civil war, which you can trace right to this training command in a lot of ways. But then as well, so now we're going to promote him and put him in charge of everything. And eventually, I mean, we can make example after example. Look at Jim Mattis. Look at Lloyd Austin. What on their resumes, what on their CVs when they were in the Marines and the Army in terms of their actual conduct as commanding generals makes you think that these men won something and they should now be our secretaries of defense. I mean, so you see that all throughout the American military establishment, the way we fight wars, the way we prepare ourselves for war. So much of it's dominated by politics, whether it's outside the military or the politics inside the military, as you were alluding to. And of course, the needs of our military industrial complex, the fact that the priority in Washington, D.C. is not the ability to fight and win wars, but it's to ensure that the weapons makers' profits, that their stock prices, their stock value continually rises.
Okay, now I'm actually going to touch on all those things, nearly everything you just said in that last little phrase there. We already have set up to talk about here, and we're going to talk about the implications of nearly all of those. And so one of the first ones is that all the things you described really within the United States, both inside and kind of outside the operational capacity of our armed forces, is also at display in NATO. And I don't think there's any surprise about this, since we kind of are leading the show and that everybody's following our lead in all the bad ways as well. But first of all, I want to look at one example from the West that is different from all the rest, and that is Hungary and their leader, Viktor Orban. Now, he gets a lot of bad press in the West and within NATO and within the United States, but he is the one guy that's actually saying, look, let's try to get some peace. So he last week, a few days back, went to Kiev to talk to Zelensky. Had to talk to him in face-to-face in Ukraine since the war had started, and had a couple of tense engagements with him in public in other locations around Europe or so. But he went to see him, and he went to offer a negotiated settlement. He said, let's have a ceasefire first, then let's figure out the negotiated settlement, as opposed to doing it the other way around, which he knew was going to fall on deaf ears, and sure enough, it did. Well, today, and literally just an hour or so ago, some of these images were shown that Orban, who is currently the rotating president of the European Union, went to Moscow to talk again to Putin. And here is at least part of his remarks just before the show started.
Over the last 2.5 years, we have realized that without diplomacy, without channels of communication, we won't be able to achieve peace. The world will not come by itself. We need to work towards it. And ways of achieving peace is exactly what we have been discussing today with Mr. President. I wanted to see which path would be the shortest towards the end of the war.
So now the thing about Orban, Gary, this will be a little bit out of order, but in just a second, if you can bring up the one where he's given his his understanding of how the war is going on. One of the reasons why Orban gets a bad rap in the West is because they think he's pro-Putin. I hear that all the time. He's the most pro-Putin leader with the West. But as he says many times, if people actually listen to what he says as opposed to the caricatures of him, you get a different impression. Here he was in 2023 talking about what his motivation is for seeking a negotiated settlement.
Really think there is no chance of Ukraine winning.
That's my
point. They stand very little chance of winning without the aid which you are currently blocking.
No, my position is that looking at the reality, looking at the figures, looking at the surroundings, looking at the fact that NATO is not ready to send troops, it's obvious that there is no victory for poor Ukrainians on the battlefield. That's my position.
So if his position is the same as yours and ours are, perhaps he watched our show. I don't know. then the only rational thing to do, if you care about the pointless loss of human life, is to seek a negotiated settlement and to try to bring the two sides together. So that sounds like exactly what he's trying to get done here.
Yeah, and everything else you can say about Viktor Orban on this issue, he seems to be the only man or woman, the only honest man or woman in power in Europe. The danger that he, I think, is looking at from his perspective, so close to the actual war. I think that's one of the things that I've been trying to get across to people in Europe, is that you have to understand the American mindset here. The Americans who are supporting the war in Ukraine, Republicans, Democrats, whoever, they have this very real belief. It is essential to their understanding of this war that this won't touch Americans, that we are safe, that by the time it gets out of hand, it will only get out of hand in Romania or Finland or Hungary. And at that point, we'll be able to shut it off then. I mean, I really think there is this feeling among American leadership, this belief, this understanding that's essential to their construct of what we should do, that Americans are not going to be touched. And so here you have a man who understands that this will affect my country. This could affect my country in so many different ways, whether it's nuclear war or a collapse of Ukraine that sends even more refugees into Eastern and Central Europe, which I think is probably the most likely, and a thing that should be very concerning right now. Hopefully Zelensky was listening to them. I know what the Ukrainians said following the meeting between Zelensky and Orban was rejectionist. At least what I saw was rejectionist of what Orban was saying, that they're going to continue to fight on. But we also have to look at where the state of Ukraine right now. The state of Ukraine is such that, as we saw before, Danny, as you showed, they are defenseless against these massive bombs. Their power is out throughout the country. The Russians have completely decimated, not completely because they haven't touched the nuclear. There's still energy there, but they have just
significant reduction.
Yes, I mean, the press gangs that are out on the street abducting men and sending them to the front, the constant flow of the dead and wounded back from the front lines, public opinion. You find different public opinion sources, but the majority of Ukrainians still supportive of this war. But we all know that the time it takes for public opinion to go from supportive to panic is not very long. And the fact that you have things like these, again, like what you showed, that video there in Chasiv Yar, of these glide bombs that are unstoppable. The fact that nothing works, everyone's pinning their hopes on the F-16s, the press gangs, right, that are inducting men into the Ukrainian army to then be sent to the front lines to likely return, and maybe just as soon as a few weeks in a box, or without their arms or their legs or without their senses. I mean, the weight of this on the Ukrainian people is massive.
And Matt, to that extent, I want to show a brief clip here from Deutsche Welle earlier today from the German media in light of Orban being in Moscow trying to find a negotiated settlement. There is, I think many of them recognize this, but they also have some additional fear. And I wonder if I could get your observations on what some of them are afraid of inside Ukraine, and how that complicates the situation, because it's not an easy thing that, well, obviously they should make a negotiated settlement, which I argue, but it's not that simple when you're looking at the people on the inside. Check this out.
When you speak to people here, they will admit that they're tired. They will admit that lots of people are scared of going to the military or have known people who've been wounded or even killed. But when you ask them, are you willing to organize a ceasefire to basically just let it stay as it is, they'll tell you as soon as that ceasefire comes into effect, Western countries will think, okay, this is now over. We don't have to support Ukraine militarily, financially, and will basically forget about Ukraine or draw down on their support to such a level that in a year, 2, 3, Russia, having rebuilt its military, can come back again and get the remainder of the country. There is a deep conviction amongst people here that Vladimir Putin is not intent on just leaving it as things are, taking off a few regions, that he wants to control this country in its entirety. And so they do not believe that by giving Russia a chance to rebuild and the West a chance to distract itself, that would actually achieve anything and give them long-term security.
Now, as a military person, I can sit here and tell you that Russia doesn't have the capacity to go into anywhere into the west of NATO or so. But I can also paint a picture why they would not want to go into Western Ukraine, much less over. But to the people who live there and they see this war, I mean, what can be said to them to make them to support this? I don't know that trust Putin is ever going to be in the cards, but what can they be told so that they see that a negotiated settlement is actually good for them, not bad?
Well, we're certainly looking as outsiders into a country that has centuries of tension, conflict between Ukrainians and Russians. It's a very complicated history, but I think that's enough. That's all we should say. They have a very complicated history. We also understand that they are a nation that was invaded. I mean, there was a coup in 2014. There's all what occurred for 8 years in the Donbass. That being said, Russia invaded Ukraine. So even those people, if you can see it in the public opinion numbers, the change in 2022 as opposed to 2021. I mean, the Russian invasion is, that puts Ukrainians, on the defensive. I mean, why wouldn't it? I mean, so they were attacked. There's this long, complicated history, and some of it, much of it, in living memory as well, in terms of their experience under the Soviets. So you also have, the fact that the Ukrainian government has banned independent media for quite a while now. They were banning it post coup 2014. They started banning some of it, but then essentially once Russia's invasion occurs, there is no independent media worth speaking of in Ukraine. I mean, the war is going so badly that you will see in Ukrainian media that's sanctioned and authorized by the Ukrainian government, reports sometimes that lets it be known how bad it's going. It slips through the censors, so to speak. So you have to understand the population in that way. What type of information are they getting? But it's also the understanding that no nation is going to be suppressed. No one's going to be occupied. I mean, this is just common to humans. We just celebrated our 4th of July yesterday, which comes down to essentially anti-occupation, get the Brits out. I mean, so what you're dealing with is something that is very human. I mean, this is essentially what you're seeing occur in Palestine, in Gaza. I mean, so the Ukrainians do have the same reasons for their fight against Russia that we can identify, that we can understand. That being said, what's the smart thing to do? And so I don't think anyone who actually follows you or I, Danny, would argue that we are pro-Putin, pro-Kremlin, pro-Russia, that we support the invasion of Ukraine, that we declared as anything other than a violation of international law, on and on and on. Same time, too, that being said, the wise thing to do, the smart thing to do, just as in Palestine, I have been supportive of Palestine publicly for a long time now. I've never once publicly supported arming the Palestinians because it's not the right strategic move. It's not the right strategic choice. It might be the emotional choice. It might be entirely within the rights, both under international law and under natural law, for people to fight against their oppression. Certainly, I agree with that. But what's the wise thing to do, particularly as an outsider, and particularly as an outsider whose country is helping ensure or who is utilizing Ukraine for their own purposes? So how much of it, I guess, is the fact that Ukrainian men are being sent to the front, being slaughtered? How much of it is actually about this resistance to occupation, this resistance to invasion? And how much of it is actually about being used as pawns in American imperial policies, right? That the idea of these Ukrainians dying for the $61 billion that was just appropriated by the U.S. Congress back in April, for the total of $175 billion that's been appropriated since February 2022. How many of those dollars were meant to achieve American policy, which is weakening Russia, as opposed to defending Ukraine's territorial independence? I would say that 175 billion was meant to weaken Russia, and maybe there's some change laying around the floor in terms going towards,
Yeah, and I'm actually going to address both of those here in just a second. In fact, let's just jump right into a piece of that here. Earlier, I don't remember if it was today or yesterday, but it may have been this morning. Stoltenberg was asked. Yeah, it was earlier today. Stoltenberg was asked at a press conference. What did he say about Ursula von der Leyen claiming that Orban was basically trying to be appeasement and to just lay down for Vladimir Putin? And you'll see the kind of comic, frankly, response of Stoltenberg, because you can see what he wants to say, but watch what he does say.
Secretary General, what does Prime Minister Viktor Orban's visit to Moscow say about the state of unity within NATO on the eve of the Washington summit? And do you agree with European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen's assessment that it represents appeasement?
Prime Minister Viktor Orban has been in Moscow before. Then he has informed us about his visits. He has also we also discussed his visits after he has returned. And Prime Minister Orban, also when I met him a couple of weeks ago, we also discussed his upcoming visit to Kiev. So you may know that he also visited Kiev recently. What is important is that all allies, also Hungary, agrees that Russia is the aggressor and Russia is responsible for the war, and that Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty must be respected.
Matt, I know you don't have a lot of time left here before you have to jump off. But Gary, if you could bring up that one headline about NATO, what they're going to do next week. I wanted to kind of tailing off what Stoltenberg just said there, because you see him humming and hawing and umming, and it's unbelievable, because he doesn't really have a good answer here. And this is what NATO's talking about ahead of next week's summit here in Washington, where it says, NATO leaders will vow to pour weapons and ammunition into Ukraine for another year, but membership is off the table. This highlights there is no strategy. What are they giving these weapons for? What do they want it to accomplish? What do they even hope that it does? How will that accomplish any kind of an end to the war or do anything? There is no even discussion of it. The only question is, how much can we afford to give? And then we'll see what we can do next year. And that is just shocking to me.
Well, and we know what next year is going to look like, Danny. And I've got some time. My electrician who's coming to my house is delayed, so I've got some more time if you want. Yeah, we know what's going to look like next year. I mean, not even next year. I mean, within a couple of months. I mean, the end of the fiscal year is coming. The new fiscal year is starting here in the U.S. in October, and there will have to be another appropriation put forward for Ukraine. So in how many months from now, I would imagine in August, maybe September, we'll start to hear about another $60 billion from the U.S. to Ukraine, or however how much they're asking for. This $43 million that NATO just approved for Ukraine, in addition to tens of billions, I think about $40 billion that the EU had just approved. I mean, so you're looking at essentially $150 billion a year being put forward by the U.S., by the EU, by NATO. I remind people that of that, say $43 billion that NATO is going to give to Ukraine, about 2/3 of that comes from the U.S. So when you look at the American numbers for this, it's even higher than the $175 billion that's been appropriated. Effectively, anything that NATO has given to Ukraine, tack on, get 2/3 of it and tack it on to the American total. Your point exactly, Danny. I'm not sure what more I can add to it. Is where does this get us? What does it do? It basically prolongs the war. The war is in jeopardy for a host of reasons. One of them, right, blatantly in our face, not in Britain, but what we've seen throughout Europe in elections, say most remarkably in France, a rejection of this war by voters. So there's been political consequences for this war throughout Europe. We're not going to see that here in the U.S. We didn't see that in Britain. We weren't going to see that in Britain. But I mean, the way that this war is unfolding, the only thing the West can do is continue to keep the balloon inflated and continue to keep it inflated with mass infusions of cash. It's terrifying to look at that front and to imagine yourself there and to imagine yourself being in those Ukrainian positions. It's not so great to think of yourself being in a Russian position either, because, it's not so great for the Russians either. But you can imagine being defenseless as the Ukrainians are right now. So the danger of the collapse on the Ukrainian line at some point, the collapse of the Ukrainian military is there. I think it's more likely that you're going to see an economic collapse. You'll see a governmental collapse. Maybe the two of them co-joined, where you can't tell which happened first. But certainly that is a danger that you have there. And then what then occurs? If Europe thinks it's bad right now, if Viktor Orban is trying to signal everybody, hey, this is really bad, we need to put an end to it, how worse is it going to be when Ukraine collapses? Now, what the Russians are looking at then, and what they're trying to avoid, and this is where it gets very complicated for the Russians, is they understand this better than any of us. And they're trying to manage a win in Ukraine against this Western money, against this Western wooden-headedness, against the Americans essentially and the Brits, and their stupidity in their leadership. They're trying to manage it so that there's not, they don't want to see a collapse occur in Ukraine, because they don't want to have an Afghanistan or a Syria in their front yard. So, can you imagine from the Russian perspective here, what they're looking at? I agree with you. They don't have the desire to conquer all of Ukraine, to move into Western Ukraine. I don't think they want to move into central Ukraine. I don't think they have the wherewithal to move into Ukraine, and they're limited in what they could do in central Ukraine. And then now, of course, they have a two-front war, essentially, a conventional frontline war, like we've seen the last 2.5 years. Plus, as they push farther west, there's the greater chance of an insurgency, which people was what the Americans and others were saying. From the beginning, right into our hands 2.5 years ago. They're going to invade Ukraine, and then we're going to do to them what we did to the Soviets in Afghanistan.
Now, I want to run something by you here, Matt. Kind of to one of the points you made just a second ago about the casualties and about the potential that could cause to possibly have a break or a collapse of some part of the Ukrainian front, and the impact that has on the Ukrainian leadership. And I want to touch on, I'm going to show you a series of 3 things here. But it appears to me that there's a similar dynamic that's playing out on the Ukraine side as there is on the NATO side, that we've made our bed. Now what do we do? How do we unmake it? How do we get out of this trouble? So you've talked about some of the NATO stuff, but here's what's happening on the Ukraine side. Gary, if you can put that Telegram channel comment that I got from earlier today up. This is pointing out that their source here says that back in March, they needed 200. The Ukraine side needed 200,000 just to replenish losses in killed and wounded, and that's saying that the casualty rates, and that's just this year, is much higher on the Ukraine side than anyone's willing to admit. But the fact that they're trying to get that many to offset losses is staggering. Now then, they're trying to recruit an additional 300,000. And you just talked about how the press gang and Gary was showing some of that issues there. But the losses are just staggering. And of course, you cannot train anybody for an offensive when you literally are grabbing them off the street and throwing them in the front line a few days later. It's physically impossible. Now, Zelensky, in a recent moment of lucidity and truth on the 27th of June, said this.
We don't have too much time, because we have a lot of wounded and dead people on the battlefield and through civilians. That's why we don't want to have this war during years. We don't have too much time, because we have a lot of.
And so now after that, he went back out and then said 3 days later, well, actually, no, we're going to keep going here. After Orban made his visit there to Ukraine and said, hey, let's have a ceasefire, Andrei Yermak, one of the chief advisors to Putin, came out and said, we're not ready to go to compromise for this very important things, and they value all the stuff that basically saying this is the outcome we desire. And so even though there's no actual rational path, we're staying with it. So when you see all of these things combined, when you see NATO just saying we don't have a solution, so we're just going to say another year of just throwing a bunch of stuff and weapons and bullets and stuff and see what happens. And you have the Ukrainian leadership themselves saying, well, we want all this outcome, so we're going to ignore the combat reality and keep going. But those are desires and aspirations on either side there. But around that you have, or in between that, you have the Ukrainian men actually on the front line, opposed by Russia, which seems to be methodical and equipped and capable to just keep the thing punching until one day just reality and truth is going to collapse both of these unsustainable narratives.
Right. And collapse happens quickly too, right? It is that domino effect we were talking about earlier, in the sense that panic strikes, like say a bank run, essentially. But, this idea of just keeping it going infused with cash, as long as the money comes in, that is essentially how the Americans worked in Iraq. That's essentially how we worked in Afghanistan. That's the way our empire has kept these governments in power, these proxy wars going, whatever you want to call them, is to keep the money flowing in. And as long as the money is flowing in, then the idea is that the panic won't set in. It's what we've seen happen, say, in Afghanistan 2021. What causes the collapse of the Afghan government? It's the fear that the American money is gone. The Afghan government starts collapsing early 2021 when Joe Biden comes into office, because they're afraid that this really is going to end and the money is going to start to dry up. And then once that panic begins, you can't pull it back. The difference here is, of course, that you're not dealing with the Taliban or with Sunni nationalists or Shia militias in Iraq. You're dealing with the Russian military. And
okay, now, Matt, hang on just a second, because what you just said there is really more important than I think, and I don't want anybody to miss this. You just talked about the dynamic that when Biden came into office and was talking about an end to the Afghan war, that caused a cascading series of events and people stopped believing things, et cetera, that the money's going to run out. We are now faced with a very similar possible dynamic here, in that President Trump is unequivocally saying, I'm going to bring this thing to an end if he wins. And based on a lot of things that are going on with just our polls and with Biden himself, that's starting to look like a lot more. You had Putin, in fact, said this about Trump's possibility.
The fact that Mr. Trump, as a presidential candidate, says that he's ready and wants to stop the war in Ukraine, we take that very seriously. Well, I haven't seen his ideas on how exactly he's going to do that, and that is the key question. But I have no doubt that he says that sincerely, and we support that.
So, to what extent? I mean, since we don't know what's going to happen until November 5th for sure, although apparently Biden's going to make some announcement tonight, and who knows where that's going to go. But what about the situation on the ground? So, regardless of all that, it seems that the chances of people thinking the way you just talked about is already on the play. How might that impact what's actually happening in the war?
Well, I think you could see it in Zelinskys' face, in the way he spoke to the media, just in the clip you just shared. It reminds me of how he looked, was it April or end of March, when Russian forces crossed over into Kharkiv, right? So they opened up extended the front, and all those prepared defenses, all the fortifications, all the prepared lines that the Ukrainians have been bragging about, that hundreds of millions of dollars have been spent on, weren't there. How the Russians just walked in. And if people remember how Zelensky looked in those days, he was a deflated man. He looked as if he had been finally shown the truth, and there was no way of excusing it or apologizing or making up for it. And I feel that that's what I saw in that clip just there. In that clip, I believe following that clip came after the debate here in the United States.
Yeah, that's
right. I mean, so in that sense, that this reality that, okay, the Americans have been telling me, don't worry about the people I've been working with, saying, don't worry about Donald Trump. We're going to win this thing. We're with you all along. Don't worry about it. And we've said this before, and we brought it up again just now with Afghanistan. The Ukrainians are going to be the next Afghans. And that sentiment that was in that piece from Deutsche Welle of being abandoned by, Ukrainian people feeling that if we go to a ceasefire, if the war stops, the Americans are going to walk away. Well, they've got good historical evidence to back up that feeling. I'm not going to tell those people they don't know what they're talking about, because they're probably right, except I don't know if I agree fully with that. Let me take a step back, because the American banks, the Western banks, BlackRock and so forth are just licking their chops, ready to jump in and take advantage of that ruined country. So it's a question of whether or not they want to be, who the Ukrainian people want to be ruled by, American banks or whoever. But certainly the fear that's there, the idea that the Ukrainian government has to be very careful with what they say now, because they could be what incites a panic. So what if the Ukrainians were to come forward, the Ukrainian government were to come forward, whether it be Zelensky and his advisors, Syrskyi or other generals, and say something that just provides that next, that next drop, that next needle, the next piece of straw, if you will, that puts that panic in motion. Because again, what you and I are seeing occurring on the Ukrainian front, the Ukrainian people are experiencing it by their men coming home destroyed, either dead, either physically wrecked, mentally, emotionally, spiritually devastated. They're seeing that, and they're seeing the press gangs. They know people have left. They know people want to leave. They certainly know the reports that if you try and flee Ukraine across the land border, if you're a man, you will be shot. All these types of things are all percolating there. If we were to go back and look at probably the public opinion polls for Afghans, say in late 2020, I imagine many of them, if asked, would say, no, we shouldn't negotiate with the Taliban. We shouldn't have on and on and on. But when the panic comes, it is overwhelming. Giving another example of how it works, we referenced Iraq and Iraq's civil war. Up until that civil war in Iraq, you had people who were living together. We'll just focus on their other ethnicities and religions there, but we'll focus on the Kurds, Shias, and Sunnis just to make it easy. They intermarried, they lived together, they worked together. But once the violence started happening, once the panic began, you couldn't trust anyone who was not your own. And that's not analogous to what I'm saying in Ukraine, but the idea that when a panic sets in, all historical precedent, all norms, how everyone feels about a situation quickly turns. And that's the real danger here. And I think that's, again, what Orban may have been trying to signal, is that what is going to come from this, whether it gets so bad that NATO puts troops into Ukraine and that gives us World War III, or there's a Ukrainian collapse and we end up having to deal with the detritus, the refuse, the results of that collapse, primarily for those countries in Central Europe, the refugees, that type of, this is what we're looking at, so best case with that $43 billion that NATO just gave to Europe to Ukraine, with the $61 billion the U.S. has gave to Ukraine back in April. Best case, Danny, we're looking at the same thing this time next year. Best case, we're looking at maybe the Russians have moved west 25, 50 kilometers, if that. Maybe it's still the same front lines. Maybe the Russians have pulled back to consolidate, and maybe the Ukrainians have actually moved east 10 or 20 kilometers. That's best case, right? That's best case.
And I don't think that the best case is going to come, because the likely case and the worst case are profoundly worse than that. Right. And I just don't see any prospect if it is. But there is no case to where Ukraine can ever drive Russia out to get their land back, or that doesn't spawn into a nuclear conflict, even if they should start to make progress on that, which I see no prospect, no possibility that they could do. So this is almost certainly just going to get a lot more Ukrainians killed. and Russia more territorial conquest. I honestly don't see any other rational way outcome other than that, unless NATO gets wise and starts taking advantage of the opening that Orban is making.
And I don't see any policy change coming from, well, with the Brits, Labour just won, took over Parliament. They're not good. That doesn't mean no change from the Brits. Labour's and Keir Starmer and those folks are in bed with this war as much as Rishi Sunak.
Yeah.
So, and on the American side, following Joe Biden's performance, how badly he's going to be doing in the polls, how desperate the campaign is going to be. If anything, they'll double down on this Ukraine war. They'll hammer away at it. This is the narrative been driving. The Democratic Party has been driving for more than 10 years, almost 10 years now, that Russia is an existential threat, and Donald Trump and the Republicans are tied to Russia, and that it's treasonous. This has been what has dominated Democratic Party talking points, campaigns, narratives for almost a decade now. They will assuredly double down on that as they become more desperate in the campaign. You have to remember, too, going back almost a year now, back to September, the first campaign ad put out by the Biden-Harris reelection campaign is of Joe Biden
wartime president.
Right, wartime president. And there's this axiom in American politics that wartime commanders in chief get elected. So if anything, we'll see this White House not just stick to, but increase, amplify American policy in Ukraine, which is incredibly dangerous. And then if everything is delayed to the point you were making, if Donald Trump wins election, is that when we see this panic happen in Ukraine because people feel that it's over? And not that the fear is that the Russians are going to come and take over, which of course I think many people do fear, whether that's likely or not. They do fear that, but also too the knowledge of what comes next, the fear of what comes next, the uncertainty of it. It's so corrupt. This again gets back to what the Russians are fearing. The Russians are fearing a Ukrainian collapse because, again, they don't want Syria. They don't want Afghanistan in their front yard, which is what they're looking at. If there's a Ukrainian collapse, that's what, you think it's all, what essentially could happen, this idea of having these warlords running various parts of Ukraine, that's not speculation. That's just not drivel for some type of fantastical novel. That very well could take place. That's what we could be looking at a year from now. Central and Western Ukraine divided up into various parts with various warlords. Or factions within some type of cobbled together government, or just some nightmare, basically.
Yeah, all because we can't do what's rational and normal.
Right.
But that is what we have. So we're going to continue to keep an eye on this. Matt, thanks so much for coming on today, and as always, giving us great clarity on this and insights that we just don't get from a lot of other people. And nobody on the mainstream media side wants to talk about any of these issues. So we really appreciate you.
Thanks, Danny. I appreciate it.
All right. And we thank you guys for watching us. We're going to have Ian Puttick on later this afternoon. He's going to be talking about the biggest election change since 1832 for the UK side. And what does all that mean for the war? And what does it just mean for Western relations in general? Tune in to see that this afternoon at 3:30 p.m. And we'll talk to you later on Daniel Davis Deep Dive.